up to half my kingdom. Men can be, persuaded with beauty. So Esther answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. That's on the third day. Going to the banquet, okay? I'll tell you something else too. If y'all realize that she fasted and everything and prayed, and then she went before the king, if you look at that, her obedience and her manner are examples today on how people ought to approach the throne of Yahweh. You just don't go in with a flippant attitude, Like some ministers and preachers you tell us, well, we're just going to go in there and crawl up in Papa's lap and just say, what's happening, Papa? In my mind, that sounds so disrespectful, if you're going to come before the throne of glory that way. So if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for them. The king and Haman. Okay. Now, if this is on the third day, it could be the 16th of Nisan is what I'm looking at. Okay. Verse 5, then the king said, bring Haman quickly that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half my kingdom it shall be done. Notice what's taking place. They're at a banquet, and how many people are there? The king, Haman, and Esther. And he just made her another promise. What do you want? I'll give you half my kingdom. What do you want? Haman's hearing this. He understands the importance, and he's got to be thinking, my goodness, I'm in the presence of the king and the queen, of everything. Right? I mean, he's got to be thinking he's, something on a stick, right? Or whatever that,
That was not on the table.
That was not on the table.
It was on the
Okay, anyway. But I mean, he's thinking that he's really, important, like a big hot dog. Yeah, he's really something important, Anyway. Verse 8, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. This will be on the 17th. Tomorrow I'll do it. Remember when they came out of Egypt at the Passover and everything went through, and then they came out, and when they went down to the waters of the Red Sea and they came up on the other side, it was on the 17th day of the month. And this is on the 17th when she said, I'm going to give you my final request. On that day was when the children were delivered, and Pharaoh and his people that were trying to kill them was destroyed. Okay? That was a kind of a picture. Now we're seeing the same thing taking place, almost exactly the same here in the book of Esther, date-wise. Verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, all the ways in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. I mean, this boy is puffed up. Isn't that what you know? Yeah. So in verse 13 it said, yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Yehudi sitting at the king's gate. You'll have to realize every place you see the word Jew in the Hebrew, it's the word Yehudi. Verse 14, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made. Notice that is the word tree. Let a tree be made. So remember, a tree can also mean a gallows, okay? 50 cubits high. That's nearly 75 feet.
quite a tree.
That's quite a tree. Quite a gallows, okay? And in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Now they're making this thing probably overnight. You know, we got people building this thing going on out there, you know. Tomorrow's the 17th, right? It's just, you know, night starting, and, you know, they're building this thing. So in chapter 6 now, Now notice, man, he's really prepared here. You know, he's really thinking that he's some hot stuff here. Okay? Wife has told him, you know, well, go build a gallows and kill that guy and get rid of that problem. You know, all this kind of stuff. And he's got all these things going. In chapter 6, that night, the king couldn't sleep. I wonder if Yahweh kept him awake. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. I guess he figured that'd put him to sleep. But in verse 2, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Here he is learning of what was written about him and what Mordecai did saved his life. I mean, can anybody see the hand of Yahweh in this whole thing? I mean, his name might not be in the book, but he is. Verse 3, then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Remember, the Torah said, if you hear of something, you have to tell it. He did, right? The Torah says, when you obey, you'll be blessed, right? And we're fixing to see the blessing that's fixing to come. So verse 4, and said, and the king said, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Mordecai just come in, and he's fixing to go tell the king to kill this Yehudi. Okay? Verse 5, the king's servant said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Can y'all see, I mean...
He's thinking,
yeah, he's figured, man, who else, you know, and he's thinking. Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor. Now notice he's saying that this is what he wants for himself. Verse 8, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king is ridden, which has a royal crest or crown placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hasten, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. I mean, this kind of...
That is very good.
You think Yahweh doesn't have sense of humor? For Mordecai the Yehudi, who sits within the king's gate, leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. Can you imagine this Haman's attitude as he's doing that? Okay? And he's thinking, he was thinking to come in there and get this guy killed, and now he's fixing to carry him around the city, proclaiming. This is the one who, what do you think he's going to be able to do later? Verse 11, so Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man the king delights to honor. Afterward Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hastened to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Yehudi descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. He ain't even got time to think about what's happening now. He's just caught up in everything now, and there's no way he can get out of it. It's rolling. In chapter 7 now. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, now this is the 17th, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you, and what is your request? Up to half my kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. To be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Satan come but to steal, kill, and destroy. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary What's the Hebrew word there for adversary?
Hasatan.
Hasatan, an enemy, is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Don't you know this boy shaking in his boots? I mean, his world has gone away. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. I mean, when this king went away mad, he knew he was in trouble, right? Verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? I mean, if this was a movie, you couldn't make it.
Oh, buddy, I can't leave the room. Boy, can that be one.
As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. That means they took a sack and put it over his head. Verse 9, now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. I mean, we see the funny that, but remember here, okay? Back on the Passover, okay? Or coming up when Messiah comes, and he's going to die on the 14th. It was the adversary who was, trying to get all these people together to kill him, right? Thinking if I kill him, I'll get rid of this and everything will be mine, right? But in the act of killing that righteous man, he wound up destroying himself. You see the comparison here? What's happened right here? Him trying to destroy. You see how Mordecai then, in this instance, can be a picture of the Messiah? Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. In Satan's haste to destroy the Messiah, he killed himself. The punishment is, the sentence has already been set, right? And he's scheduled to die. The only thing that's left in Satan's case is the actual fulfillment of it when he goes in the lake of fire. In chapter 8, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Yehudi, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. Now, look, all these things being turned over them now, the rewards that are coming to these people, okay? And not only was Mordecai, exalted before the king and led around by Haman, can you imagine this Haman running around through the streets of Shushan where the temple and the palace was and everything, leading this horse and crying out, this is what the king wants to be done to the man he wanted to honor. And all the time he's wanted to kill him. Verse 2, so the king took off his signet ring which he had taken from Haman and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil plot of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Yehudi. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Yehudi who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Yehudi, indeed I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Yehudi. You yourselves write a decree for the Yehudi as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a letter which is written in the king's name and sealed with a king's signet ring no one can revoke. So the first letter is not going to be revoked, but now a second one giving them the opportunity to defend themselves is going to be written. So the king and scribe were called at that time in the 3rd month. Now, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread is in the first, the month of Nisan. And if you count about 50 days down from that, going toward Shabbat, what month do you get to? 3rd month. Okay? Now, this is not exactly on the 50 days. It's probably a little later than that because it says it's on the 23rd day of the month, which is sometime right after Shavuot or Pentecost. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Yehudi, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the province from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Yehudi in their own script and language or dialect. Everybody heard the words of the king in their own language. Okay. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters the king permitted the Yehudi who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all people, so that the Yehudi would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. On the 13th. Now, I was just, I found out earlier that we're actually on the 13th right now, not the 14th, because the calendar's wrong again. But that's all right. We still celebrate tomorrow night and the next day, the 14th and 15th. We're just celebrating a little bit early today, but we can do it again. But on the 13th was when all this took place. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all people, so that the Yehudi would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Then the couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan the citadel. Now this was going out in the 3rd month, and they were still going to have between this time and the 12th month to get ready. Okay? Verse 15, now Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Isn't that great? Blue and white. Mm-hmm. Remember Aaron the priest, had on the white undergarments and then the robe of blue, or techelet. Verse 16, the Yehudi had light and gladness, joy and honor, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Yehudi had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Yehudi. And that's something. We better join with
celebrate.
them. I mean, they knew who was going to win, didn't they? Because fear of the Yehudi fell upon them. They became. Okay? And that's different. Remember, go back, Pharaoh and them, they feared him, so they tried to kill him because they feared him. But they figured we'd just become one of them. I guess that's where they get the old saying, you can't beat them, join them. In chapter 9. Now, verses 1 through 11 of this chapter record all those that were killed on the 13th of Adar. If we were going back, we'd have to say that'd be today, right? Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, it came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Yehudi had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Yehudi themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Yehudi gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. You realize not a single Yehudi died? Said none could withstand them, which means that nobody fought against them to win anything. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Yehudi, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Yehudi defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan the citadel the Yehudi killed and destroyed 500 men. Also Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmeshta, Arisai, Eridai, and Valyatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Yehudi, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. I think in Daniel it talks about the false Messiah being killed first, and then later on the 10 kings that had joined with him were killed later. If we go back in history, from the time of Hitler and all the top ones that were with him, there was 10 of his prominent ones that were supposed to have been hung on the gallows for war crimes, right? You realize that the only time that a sentence of being hung on the gallows was ever issued for war crimes. Otherwise, they were shot. But in this instance, they were sentenced to be hung. One of them committed suicide, so that only left the 11. And I forget which one it was when he went to the gallows. He had any last words? Remember what he said? Purim Fest, 1948. As he went, on the gallows. Anyway,
What does that mean?
Purim Fest, Festival of Purim.
I didn't
They
understand what you
understood
said.
that what they were doing was another, instance of the fulfillment here of the book of Esther. But it also points to another one in the future, which is the ultimate fulfillment. But there have been people all through history, okay? Remember, the Hitler and his people were trying to establish what? The Third Reich. Well, they were the second. Who was the First Reich? Rome.
Yeah.
Okay. Again in verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Yehudi, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Yehudi have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Yehudi who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree. Now, Haman's 10 sons have already been killed, right? And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. They're already dead, but now they're going to be hung out there for everybody to see. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Yehudi who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Yehudi in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Verse 17. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Yehudi who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th day of the month they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness. So we got all 3 days. We can get it right. We can still celebrate. Therefore the Yehudi of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar, of gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. Probably in the Hebrew this would say to a holy day or a set-apart day, and then it was changed in English to a holiday, which is what most of the translators think they really are. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Yehudi who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. That's what I thought we were doing tonight, and tomorrow would be the 14th and the 15th, but depending on how the new moon came, though this is actually the 13th and 14th. But as the days in which the Yehudi had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holy day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another. How about that? And gifts to the poor. So the Yehudi accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Yehudi, had plotted against the Yehudi to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and destroy them. Well, I need everybody to understand, celebrating Purim is not a commanded festival, okay? But because people don't do it, they have very little understanding of how the festivals point to, the false Messiah and so forth. And these are not commanded, but they still give us an awful lot of understanding going back into the other words of prophecy of Daniel and some of the other books. So when we celebrate the festival, we're actually looking into the word of prophecy concerning Messiah. And remember in Revelations it says what? The word of prophecy is the Spirit. Okay. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Yehudi should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Actually, when Esther there is not the word, that should be the word, I think it's she. But when she came before the king, and then she commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman or he had devised against the Yehudi should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Sometimes they put names in there in the English text when it's just got pronouns in the Hebrew. So they call these days Purim, after the name Pur, which means lot. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Yehudi established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants, and all who should join them. Isn't that amazing? You know, it's looking forward to all those who are going to join in and become part of the family down the road. That's essence, right?
That's children.
Amen.
And that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written, or to the writings, and according to this prescribed, or the moed, the appointed time. That these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. That these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Yehudi, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. See, we're just now learning of it, okay? But praise Yahweh, the memory hasn't gone away, and we can be able to come back and learn and understand. Verse 29, Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Yehudi, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Yehudi to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Achashverosh, words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Yehudi and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And in chapter 10, And King Achashverosh imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia, the Medes and the Persians? For Mordecai the Yehudi was second to King Achashverosh, and was great among the Yehudi, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. Shalom. Well, let me stop all this stuff.
Speaking peace.
Is this all?